For my live class alternative assignment, I'm going to discuss some of my main takeaways from the material on aversive control, particularly negative reinforcement, avoidance, punishment, behavioral, resurgent, and the ethical issues that come with using aversive control. One thing that really stood out to me from this unit was sort of like the difference between escape and avoidance. I really thought it was easy, like kind of interesting how avoidance can become persistent, and how Mauer's two-factor theory proposes that avoidance involves both respondent and operant conditioning. First, a neutral stimulus is paired with an aversive stimulus and becomes a conditioned stimulus capable of producing a conditioned emotional response. Then an operant response allows the individual to escape that conditioned stimulus and avoid the aversive event. The reduction in the aversive condition helps maintain the avoidance behavior. However, one problem identified in the material is that avoidance can continue even when the conditioned fear appears to extinguish. I think about this one all the time. I work with a lot of people who have anxiety disorders and OCD, and do a lot of work around that with functional behavior assessment and different treatments. And I think that this is just one of the most interesting things when thinking about behavior outside of a laboratory. Someone might repeatedly avoid a situation because it's worked for them in the past, and the fact that the negative outcome does not occur can actually make it difficult for the person to learn whether that outcome would have even occurred at all. And I see that a lot in like my practice and just kind of with the exposure therapy world and all that kind of stuff. The material on Sidman's avoidance kind of provides another way of thinking about this. So Sidman demonstrated that avoidance could develop without an explicit warning stimulus. Instead, behavior can be maintained because responding reduces the overall rate of aversive events. And I really found the SS interval as the time between aversive events with no response occurs, and the RS interval as the amount of time the aversive event is delayed following a response. Interesting. I think I was just like naturally doing this in FBAs and looking at that data without really like considering where it came from or the literature. So I'm going to dig into this more. And it really kind of helped me to understand that like avoidance does not necessarily require someone to experience fear in the way we really like normally think about it. We can really analyze the environment contingencies and ask what consequences are really maintaining the behavior. And of course, punishment. What I think is like really important is that behavior decreasing does not necessarily mean it has been permanently eliminated, and the behavior resurgence graph in the review material really illustrates this point. It shows responding occurring at a higher level during baseline, decreasing during the punishment phase, and then recovering or resurging after. And this really connects directly to our Smith et al. Article we reviewed on resurgence. What I found especially interesting from that study was the relationship between alternative reinforcement and relapse. The rich alternative reinforcement condition produced very strong suppression of the original target behavior, but when alternative reinforcement was removed, the target behavior showed substantial resurgence. And that really creates an important applied question. We obviously want interventions to reduce problem behavior effectively, but short-term behavior reduction cannot be our only measure of success. We also have to think about what happens when reinforcement changes, treatment is thinned, or the person encounters a different environment, which kind of goes into how I practice in group homes, where I really try to look at creating really dense schedules of congruent reinforcement schedules so that the behavior will maintain. That's kind of what I live by, and also creating like behavior cuffs because long after I leave the case, I want people to maintain the skills and behaviors that they were taught. So really, I think that kind of leads us into the most important part of this unit, which is ethics. And really, like, I think we specifically connect aversive control with Sidman's discussion of coercion and the use of threat of punishment to control other people's behavior. And that really made me think about the amount of control behavior analysts can potentially have over another person's environment. Knowing that a consequence can reduce behavior does not automatically mean we should use it. We have to consider whether the intervention is socially valid, whether less restrictive alternatives are available, what unintended effects might occur, and whether we are teaching the individual an appropriate behavior that can replace the behavior we're trying to decrease. For me, that is probably the biggest takeaway from this material. Aversive control demonstrates why understanding behavioral function matters. Oh my gosh, I wrote this wrong. Why understanding behavior function matters so much. Escape, avoidance, punishment, and resurgence can look relatively straightforward when we define them, but the actual contingencies can be really complicated. So a behavior that disappears under one set of conditions may return when those conditions change. Similarly, an avoidance behavior that appears irrational from the outside may make sense when we examine the reinforcement history maintaining it. For example, I have somebody who's like incredibly afraid of like big open grassy areas, and it didn't make sense to anybody until we did more of like research into their history and found out that they had been hit by a golf ball. And it was a person with like kind of like a nonverbal person, adult, who couldn't communicate. So it wasn't really irrational that they were afraid of big open grassy spaces with manicured lawns, because it looked like the same place where they got hit with a golf ball. They happened to just be walking on a golf course and didn't realize it when this occurred. But anyway, so we should always ask, did this intervention decrease the behavior? I think we also need to ask, instead of only asking that, we should also ask, why did the behavior decrease? What did the person learn instead? And what is likely to happen when these contingencies are no longer in place? 2 questions I would have liked to discuss during the lab class are, when a reinforcement-based intervention produces strong behavior change, but also creates the possibility of resurgence, when reinforcement is removed, how should practitioners plan for that possibility from the beginning of treatment? And given the potential negative effects of coercive control, are there situations in which punishment is ethically justified? And what evidence specifically would we need before deciding that reinforcement-based approaches are insufficient? And these really stood out to me because I feel like they connect the basic behavioral principles from this unit with the decisions we may eventually have to make in applied practice. Thank you. Bye.